The galaxy was a vast expanse of stars and unknowns now under the iron grip of the Vothra Empire. They had come from the deep voids of space, their ships dark and massive. As they swept through the galaxy, enslaving all in their path, no species could stand against them. The once free planets fell like dominoes, each a new prize for the Vothra, their technology unmatched, their armies unrelenting, and their cruelty unbound. They claimed world after world, extinguishing civilizations as if they had never existed. But in the shadow of their conquests, a small flicker of defiance was born. It began as whispers in the dark, hidden in the craters of forgotten moons and the ruins of long-lost worlds scattered across the galaxy. Humans who had once roamed the stars now lived in the most remote corners of the galaxy, few in number, but with a fire that burned bright. They had escaped the initial wave of Vothra conquest, and they would not be silenced. These survivors had begun to regroup, their numbers swelling with the brave, the willing, and those desperate for something more than subjugation. They called themselves the last hope of the galaxy, and they began to prepare for war. They knew that the only way to stop the Vothra was not through brute strength, but through something far more dangerous, something the Vothra had never understood: human ingenuity. They had underestimated humanity from the start, dismissing them as weak, primitive, even as nothing more than fodder for their slave pits. But what the Vothra didn't realize was that humans had an insatiable hunger for survival, a thirst for knowledge, and an unparalleled capacity to adapt and overcome. And so the small band of human rebels began to piece together a plan, a weapon, something ancient, something the Vothra could never have predicted. Buried deep beneath a desolate moon, on the edge of the galaxy, was a forgotten ruin, a place the Vothra had never dared to investigate. The humans had heard stories, rumors from the few surviving records of the galaxy's past about a superweapon so powerful it could change the fate of any battle. And so the rebels set out to find it. But they were not alone. The Vothra were watching, and they had been tracking the humans' movements with their vast network of spies. Their every move had been anticipated. The humans knew the risks, and they knew that time was running out. They had only one chance to find the weapon before the Vothra crushed them all. So they rallied their forces and began their journey through the stars. Their mission was clear: infiltrate the Vothra's controlled systems, make it to the forgotten moon, uncover the weapon, and escape before the Vothra could unleash their fury upon them. It was a mission fraught with peril, but for the rebels it was their only hope. They had no choice but to push forward, for they knew that if they failed, this galaxy would fall under the Vothra's rule forever, and humanity would be lost to the darkness of the stars. The journey to the forgotten moon was not an easy one. The rebels had to navigate through dangerous space sectors controlled by the Vothra fleet, every turn a potential trap, every signal a possible betrayal. The humans moved in the shadows, their ships cloaked, and their movements calculated with precision, each mission an act of defiance against the might of the Vothra. They had become masters of stealth and subterfuge, operating in small cells, hidden within the far reaches of space. The humans were used to surviving on the edge of extinction. But as the rebel fleet approached the moon, the tension in the air became thick with uncertainty. Their plan was simple: infiltrate the Vothra blockade using stealth technology and ground teams to make their way to the surface of the moon. The weapon was said to be buried beneath an ancient temple, long abandoned by the galaxy's forgotten ancestors. But no one knew exactly what they would face. When they arrived, the last thing they expected was to find a Vothra stronghold waiting for them. The Vothra had learned of their presence and prepared to strike back. They were ready for war, and they would not let this moon fall into the hands of those who dared oppose them. The human fleet arrived at the moon's orbit to find it surrounded by Vothra warships, their engines glowing with deadly intent. The rebels had underestimated the Vothra's reach, and now they would pay the price. The battle began with a brutal flash of energy beams, as the Vothra ships unleashed a barrage of firepower at the human fleet. The rebels fought back with everything they had, their ships dodging and weaving in the chaos of the battle. But the Vothra were relentless, and the humans' numbers were few. Each strike that hit their ships sent a ripple of fear through their ranks. But they pressed on undeterred. They had no choice: victory or death. The humans had come too far to turn back. As the rebel fleet engaged the Vothra forces in the skies above the moon, a team of elite human soldiers descended to the surface, led by Captain Jax. They were tasked with reaching the temple, where the weapon lay hidden in the ancient ruins, but landing on the surface was no easy feat. Vothra ground forces had already set up a defense perimeter using their advanced technology to create traps and surveillance systems. The humans moved carefully through the craggy terrain, staying out of sight and avoiding direct confrontation with the enemy. As they made their way toward the temple, Jax's team encountered a group of Vothra sentinels patrolling the area. The rebels took cover behind rocky outcroppings and waited for the perfect moment to strike. With a quiet command, Jax led his soldiers into a swift and brutal assault. Using their superior tactics and close combat expertise, they neutralized the sentinels one by one without alerting the rest of the Vothra forces. The team continued their advance toward the temple. With every step, the ancient ruins grew closer, the air thick with anticipation. But the closer they got, the more they realized they were not alone. Something in the darkened halls of the temple was stirring, an unknown force that had lain dormant for eons, waiting for someone to awaken it. The rebels pressed on, unaware that their arrival had already set in motion events beyond their control. The weapon they sought was not just a tool of destruction, it was something far more dangerous than they could ever imagine. As Jax's team reached the outer entrance of the ancient temple, they could feel the weight of the air thick with something unknown. The ground beneath their boots was cold and uneven. The ruins of the structure loomed before them like a forgotten sentinel of an ancient age. The rebels had come prepared with advanced tools and weapons, but they knew this place was unlike anything they had encountered before. It was quiet, almost too quiet for a battlefield, surrounded by the sounds of distant explosions and the clash of fleets in the sky above. It felt as though time itself had paused within these walls. The entrance to the temple was a massive archway carved from stone so old it seemed to defy the passage of millennia. Intricate symbols covered its surface, each one telling a story that no one alive could read. Jax motioned for his team to halt. He had never seen anything like it before. These ruins were not just remnants of a lost civilization, they were alive with an energy that hummed beneath the surface, as if the very walls were watching them. The team took a deep breath and proceeded inside. With each step, the air grew colder and the silence more profound. The walls of the temple seemed to close in around them, the flickering lights from their torches revealing strange murals etched into the stone showing beings unlike any species they had ever seen. Beings that stood tall and regal, surrounded by otherworldly machines, technology far beyond anything humanity or the Vothra could create. The deeper they ventured into the temple, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. An eerie presence seemed to follow them, lurking just out of sight, until they reached the heart of the structure, a vast chamber with towering columns that stretched up into an unseen ceiling. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on that pedestal was the weapon. It glowed faintly, its surface smooth and alien yet familiar in its design. It was as though it had been waiting for them. But as Jax's team stepped forward to claim it, a sudden rumble shook the ground beneath their feet. The walls of the temple trembled as a deep voice echoed through the chamber. It was a voice that spoke not through sound, but through the very air itself, the voice of the Ancient Ones, the beings who had created this place long ago. It spoke of their destruction and the rise of the Vothra, who had desecrated the legacy of the stars. But it also spoke of humanity and its potential for greatness. The rebels froze as the air around them thickened, and the weapon before them seemed to come alive. The surface of the pedestal began to shift, revealing hidden mechanisms that had remained dormant for eons. As the ancient voice continued, it spoke of a choice, one that would shape the future of the galaxy forever. The weapon before them was not just a tool of war, it was the key to unlocking an unimaginable power, one that could either save or destroy the galaxy. The choice would not be easy, and it would not come without sacrifice. But the humans now standing at the threshold of this power were the only ones capable of wielding it. The voice urged them to make their decision quickly. The Vothra were already upon them, and time was running out. With the weight of the galaxy on their shoulders, Jax stepped forward and placed his hand on the pedestal. The weapon responded with a brilliant surge of energy that lit up the chamber, blinding them all for a moment. When the light subsided, they realized the true cost of what they had awakened. The weapon was no mere object, it was an ancient intelligence, a living force that had the power to reshape the fabric of the galaxy itself. The rebels now held the key to a power they barely understood, and a future that was uncertain. As the Vothra's forces closed in on their position, They knew one thing for sure: their struggle had just become far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The chamber trembled with the awakening of the weapon, its energy surging through the temple. Like a living thing, the ancient intelligence pulsed with power, filling the air with an electric hum. As the rebels stood frozen before it, the walls seemed to shift around them, revealing new pathways and hidden chambers, once sealed by time itself. The voice continued its cryptic message, urging them to act quickly. But the weight of the choice lay heavy upon them. They knew they could not just take the weapon and use it without fully understanding what they had unleashed. The very fabric of the galaxy was at stake, and the weapon's true nature was still a mystery. The air was thick with tension. As the rebels gathered their courage, their minds racing with the implications of the ancient being's words, Jax stood at the forefront, his eyes locked on the glowing pedestal where the weapon rested. As the team looked to him for guidance, he was their leader, but even he was unsure how to proceed. The weapon was far more than a tool of destruction. It was a force of creation, a catalyst for change. Its power could shift the balance of the galaxy forever. And with the Vothra closing in, there was no time to waste. Jax made a decision. He stepped forward and activated the weapon's core. With a sharp command, the pedestal hummed, and the energy swirling within it coalesced into a single beam of light that shot out into the sky above the temple. The rebel team held their breath as they watched the light pierce the heavens and disappear into the distance. The weapon had responded, but its true purpose was still unclear. Suddenly, a low rumble echoed from beneath their feet. The Vothra were upon them. The ground shook as the entrance to the temple collapsed in on itself, trapping them inside. Jax cursed under his breath. They had no time to escape and nowhere to run. They were forced to fight their way out or die trying. The rebel team moved quickly, taking cover behind the temple's columns. As the first wave of Vothra soldiers burst into the chamber, their weapons charged and ready to annihilate the humans. But the weapon had already begun to change the dynamics of the battle. As the Vothra advanced, the temple itself seemed to respond. The columns shifted, the floor cracked open, and strange alien machines emerged from the depths of the ruins like guardians awakened by the weapon's call. The Vothra hesitated for a moment, stunned by the sudden appearance of these ancient constructs. But they quickly recovered and opened fire. The rebels wasted no time. They had no choice but to fight back. As the Vothra forces advanced in full force, the rebels split into smaller teams, using their guerrilla tactics to take down the Vothra one by one. But the machines the weapon had awakened were far more than they could have anticipated. The battle was a chaotic storm of fire and steel. As the ancient guardians tore through the Vothra ranks with ruthless efficiency, the humans fought alongside them, pushing the enemy back. But every step forward was met with brutal retaliation. The tide of the battle was shifting, but the rebels knew they could not hold out much longer. The weapon's energy was growing unstable. The temple itself was starting to crumble around them. Jax realized that they had to make a choice. They could either escape with the weapon or risk everything to use its full power to destroy the Vothra once and for all. With the Vothra closing in and their path to the surface blocked, there was no turning back. It was now or never. As Jax's heart pounded in his chest, he made the only decision. He could lead the charge straight into the heart of the Vothra forces and fight for the future of the galaxy, knowing full well that even if they succeeded, there would be no guarantee they would make it out alive. The chamber erupted into chaos as Jax and his team sprinted toward the heart of the Vothra forces. The ancient guardians fought fiercely alongside them, their weapons and shields pulsing with energy that the Vothra could not counter. The rebels moved with precision, using the temple's shifting architecture to their advantage, taking cover behind the columns and walls that seemed to grow and change at will. The Vothra were relentless, their weapons devastating, but the humans were no longer fighting with only their own strength. They fought with the power of the weapon coursing through them. They felt its presence in their minds, a silent guide urging them forward. They could hear its voice now clearer than before, its knowledge flowing through their consciousness like a torrent, guiding their movements, their attacks, their decisions. The rebels seemed to move as one, their unity and coordination amplified by the weapon's presence. As they cut through the Vothra forces, they realized that they were not just fighting for their survival, they were fighting for something much greater. They were fighting for the freedom of every world under the Vothra's rule. The weapon had awakened something inside them, something they had long forgotten, the will to fight back against impossible odds, the belief that they could not just survive but prevail. The Vothra were faltering under the relentless assault of the rebels. But they had not yet given up. They regrouped and pressed on, sending wave after wave of soldiers into the fray. The battle was far from over. As the rebels fought to push through the Vothra's defenses, the temple around them continued to shake and rumble, the weapon's power destabilizing the very foundation of the ruins. The air was thick with energy and the scent of burning metal. As explosions rang out from all sides, the rebels fought with everything they had, their weapons drawn, their spirits burning with determination. They knew that they could not afford to lose, not now, not when the galaxy's future hung in the balance. Jax could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The weapon was powerful, yes, but its cost was high. Each use drained them. It drained the temple itself. The rebels were not the only ones feeling its effects. The Vothra were too. And Jax realized with sudden clarity that this weapon was not meant to be wielded by any one species. It was a force beyond comprehension, a force that could reshape the very universe. But at what cost? They were playing with fire, and if they were not careful it could consume them all. But there was no time for hesitation. The Vothra were regrouping, and their forces were overwhelming. The rebels had to make their stand now, or risk losing everything. Jax called for his team to fall back to a defensive position. They would hold the line here, and use the weapon's full potential to create an opening for their escape. He knew it was a dangerous gamble, but it was their only chance. The Vothra continued to press forward, their numbers growing. As they closed in on the rebel position, Jax's heart raced, his mind racing with the weight of the choice before him. But as the energy from the weapon surged once more, he knew what had to be done. With a roar of defiance, he ordered his team to activate the final sequence, and the temple trembled once more as the weapon unleashed its full power in a blinding wave of energy that consumed everything in its path. The Vothra forces were torn apart by the sheer force of the blast, their ships in the sky disintegrating. As the weapon's power spread out across the battlefield, the rebels watched in awe and terror as the weapon continued to unleash its fury against their enemies. But as the light of the explosion faded and the silence settled in, they realized that the battle was not over. The weapon had changed everything, but the cost had been high. The temple was collapsing. The energy field that had protected them was failing. The Vothra were not entirely destroyed, and time was running out. The rebels had only one choice: to escape and fast, or risk being buried beneath the ruins of their victory. The collapse of the temple was inevitable. As the weapon's power surged through its ancient walls, the very foundation of the structure groaned under the weight of the unleashed energy. The rebels knew they had no time to waste. The air around them crackled with static as the energy field that had protected them began to flicker and die. The Vothra forces were regrouping, their remaining soldiers marching forward with unyielding determination. Despite the massive losses they had sustained from the weapon's blast, the rebels had struck a decisive blow. But it had come at a cost. The temple was falling apart around them, and there was no guarantee they would make it out alive. Jax's mind raced as he scanned the ruins for an escape route. The exit was blocked by rubble and falling debris. The weapon's destructive wave had made the path to freedom even more dangerous. The ground beneath them continued to tremble as the structure shifted and collapsed with every passing second. Jax shouted orders to his team, telling them to move quickly and stay close. They would need to find a way to survive long enough to reach their ships above. But it would not be easy. The Vothra were not far behind, and the battle was far from over. The rebels moved quickly, navigating the crumbling ruins, their footsteps echoing in the vast chambers that had once been a place of power, now reduced to a tomb for the dead and dying. As they moved deeper into the wreckage, they realized they were being hunted. The Vothra soldiers had learned to adapt to the chaos, and they had begun to close in on the rebels. Every corner they turned brought them closer to the enemy, but Jax was determined to lead his team to safety. He had seen too many fall before him, and he would not let their sacrifice be in vain. But the weapon that had given them the power to strike back against the Vothra, now seemed like a curse. Its energy was unstable, and the rebels were beginning to feel its effects in their bodies, their strength warning, their senses dulling. They were not meant to wield such power, and the cost was becoming clear. Jax gritted his teeth and urged his team on. They couldn't afford to stop. They had to keep moving, or they would all be buried alive. The path ahead was treacherous, filled with collapsing walls and unstable floors, but the rebels were used to danger. They had trained for moments like this, and they knew that if they kept their wits about them they could survive. But as they reached the outer chambers, the entrance to the surface seemed farther away than ever before. The Vothra were closing in on them. The rebels could hear the unmistakable sound of their boots echoing through the tunnels, and their weapons charging for the final assault. Jax's pulse quickened. He could see the exit ahead, but the Vothra were already there waiting for them. They had anticipated the rebels' every move, and now they were ready to end the fight once and for all. Jax's heart raced as he made a split-second decision. He turned to his team and shouted at them to move ahead. He would hold off the Vothra long enough for them to escape. He knew it was a suicide mission, but he didn't care. His team had already given everything they had, and he would not let them die in vain. The rebels moved toward the exit. As Jax turned to face the oncoming Vothra, his weapon drawn, he could see the grim determination in their eyes as they advanced. But Jax didn't flinch. He had made his choice, and now he would fight until his last breath. The first wave of Vothra soldiers descended upon him, and the battle began in earnest. With the weapon's power fading, Jax relied on his training, his instincts. As the Vothra pressed forward, he fought with everything he had. Every swing of his weapon, every strike of his fists, was a plea for his team to make it out. But he knew deep down that this might be the end. The rebels were close to escaping, but Jax's sacrifice would be the final push they needed to survive. Jax fought with everything he had, his body moving on sheer will, as the Vothra soldiers closed in, their weapons flashing with deadly intent. Each strike from the enemy pushed him back, but he didn't relent. He had trained for this moment for years, and now it was all coming to a head. The sound of battle echoed through the crumbling temple walls as his team moved toward the exit. Jax's eyes never left the advancing Vothra. He had to hold them off just a little longer. If they made it out, if they reached the surface, then the mission would succeed, even if it cost him everything. With a roar of defiance, he charged into the oncoming Vothra, cutting through their ranks with brutal efficiency. His weapon sang through the air, each strike carving through alien flesh and bone. But the numbers were overwhelming, and even Jax's incredible skill could not hold them back forever. Every hit from the Vothra sent shockwaves through his body, his energy draining with every movement. The power from the weapon had faded, and he could feel his strength slipping, but his resolve was unshakable. He would hold the line until his team made it out alive. He had promised them victory, and he would not break that promise. Not now, not when they were so close. He fought like a man, possessed his every movement an act of defiance against the Vothra that had slaughtered so many worlds. The rebels were almost there. He could see the light from the surface filtering through the cracks in the walls. He knew they would make it out, but as the Vothra pushed forward, their numbers overwhelming, Jax realized his time was running out. He could feel the coldness of his body creeping in, his limbs growing numb with exhaustion. But he would not fall, not yet. The Vothra soldiers were closing in on him, their weapons aimed for the kill. But Jax had one last move left. He threw himself at the enemy with everything he had, charging forward with reckless abandon, his weapon cleaving through the air and taking down one Vothra soldier after another. But the Vothra leader appeared from the shadows, his dark eyes locked onto Jax with a predatory gaze. The Vothra leader raised his weapon and fired a blast of energy that struck Jax in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. Pain exploded through his body as he struggled to breathe, but he didn't let go. He couldn't let go. He reached for his weapon and gripped it with his last ounce of strength. He could see the exit now. The rebels were almost there. They were so close. The Vothra leader loomed over him, his weapon raised for the final strike. But just as he was about to bring it down, Jax made his move. With a defiant roar, he launched himself at the Vothra leader, using the last of his strength to knock him off balance. With a brutal strike to the chest, the Vothra leader stumbled back. Just as the rebels emerged from the temple, their escape route finally opened. The rebels fired their weapons, taking down the remaining Vothra soldiers and pushing forward toward the surface. Jax's vision blurred as the world around him started to fade. He could feel the weight of his body pressing down on him, but he knew they had made it out. He had held them off long enough. The rebels had survived, and now it was time for them to take the fight to the Vothra once and for all. With one final breath, Jax let go and collapsed into the darkness. But in his heart he knew that his sacrifice had not been in vain. The weapon had been secured. The rebels had won the day, and the Vothra's reign of terror was coming to an end. The rebels emerged from the crumbling temple into the light of the alien world above them, their breath heavy from the exertion, and the adrenaline. Their bodies battered, but their spirits unbroken. They had made it out alive, but the cost was heavy. Jax had given everything to ensure their escape, and now the team was left to carry on without him. They didn't speak at first, the silence between them, heavy with grief, and lost the reality of what had just transpired sinking in. They had lost their leader, their friend, and the one person who had believed in them more than anyone else. They had just witnessed the ultimate sacrifice. The team gathered around for a moment of silence, their heads bowed in respect for Jax. They all knew that without his final push, they wouldn't have made it out, but now wasn't the time to mourn. They had to keep moving. The Vothra was still out there, and they were coming for them. They had no idea how much time they had before the Vothra regrouped and descended on them once more, but they knew they couldn't wait. They had to keep fighting. Jax's sacrifice had shown them the way forward. They could not let it be in vain. The weapon was in their hands, and now they had the power to strike back at the Vothra. The rebellion could rise again. The team moved quickly, securing their position and preparing for the next phase of their plan. They knew that the Vothra were not easily defeated, and that the war was far from over. But they also knew that they had something that the Vothra could never take from them: hope. Jax had given them hope in the darkest of times. He had reminded them that even in the face of insurmountable odds, they could still fight back. They would continue his mission. They would honor his memory by defeating the Vothra once and for all. They made contact with their fleet high above the planet and began organizing the next phase of their strike. The weapon would be their key to victory, but they needed to find a way to harness its power without destroying themselves in the process. They had learned firsthand how dangerous it could be, and now they had to find a way to use it wisely. The team worked tirelessly over the following days, analyzing the weapon and its effects on their bodies. As the energy within it fluctuated, they studied the alien technology and tried to decode the mysteries of its origins. They knew they didn't have much time. The Vothra were preparing their next move, and their forces were vast, but the rebels were determined. They had to strike first. They could not let the Vothra take the initiative again. The war had to end now. They had already lost too much, and they couldn't afford to lose anything more. The weapon had to be their answer. They had to master it and use it to defeat the Vothra once and for all. The rebels knew they couldn't do it alone. They had to unite with other factions across the galaxy, those who had been oppressed by the Vothra for so long, those who had suffered under their rule. The rebellion needed to be more than just a few small cells scattered across the stars. It needed to be a united front, a force powerful enough to crush the Vothra and bring freedom to the galaxy. The team sent out the call to every corner of the galaxy, rallying those who would stand with them. They knew that this would be their final stand. They could not afford to fail. The war was about to reach its climax, and the galaxy's fate hung in the balance. The Vothra would come for them, but they would be ready. They would honor Jax's legacy by showing the Vothra what it meant to face the might of humanity and all who stood against tyranny. The rebels had lost much, but they had not lost hope, and that was something the Vothra could never destroy. The rebels worked through the night, their minds sharp despite the exhaustion. They had endured the days of hiding, running, and fighting had taken a toll on them, but their determination burned bright. They were ready for what was to come. The weapon was their key, but they were still uncertain about how to wield it. Its power was immense and volatile, but they had no choice. The galaxy was depending on them. The Vothra were preparing for their final assault. They knew it was only a matter of time before they would strike, and the rebels had to be ready. They had no room for mistakes, no time for hesitation. The weapon's energy fluctuated as they tested it, trying to understand how to control its raw force. Its pulse was erratic, but with each passing day, they learned more, each step closer to harnessing its true potential. They connected with other resistance groups across the galaxy and gathered allies for what would be the largest battle they had ever fought. The Vothra had underestimated humanity, and now they would pay the price. The alliance grew stronger each day. The rebels knew that they would have to launch a multi-front assault to overwhelm the Vothra and weaken their command structure. They would hit their strongholds, sabotage their supply lines, and strike directly at their leadership. The rebels knew that if they were to have any hope of winning, they had to break the Vothra's will to fight, destroy their sense of invincibility, and make them fear the one force they had never considered: the humans. They had underestimated the power of the galaxy's underdog species, and it was time for them to learn just how wrong they were. The rebels led the charge, their ships cutting through the stars like a storm, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. Their fleets clashed with the Vothra's forces in the vast emptiness of space, and for the first time in years, the rebels felt the tide shift in their favor. They fought with everything they had, with every ounce of their will, and the weapon's power crackled through the air, lighting up the dark expanse with bursts of energy that sent shockwaves through the Vothra ships. Their numbers began to dwindle as the rebels pushed forward, targeting their command ships and leaders with ruthless precision. But the Vothra were not going to give up without a fight. They retaliated fiercely, their fleets striking back with brutal force. Each engagement was a test of endurance and willpower, but the rebels were relentless. They knew that the only way to win was to keep moving forward, never stopping, never backing down. The Vothra began to panic. They had never expected such a strong resistance to their rule. They had thought humanity and their allies were nothing more than a fleeting nuisance. But they had bravely underestimated them. Now the Vothra were scrambling to regroup. But it was too late. The rebels had already set their sights on their final target, the heart of the Vothra Empire, the central command station, where the Vothra leaders sat at the pinnacle of their power. It was there that the final battle would take place. The weapon would be their key to victory. It was no longer a question of whether they could control it, but how far they were willing to go to use it to end the war once and for all. As they closed in on the Vothra command center, the final battle began to unfold before them. The stakes had never been higher. The rebels knew that this was their last chance to bring peace to the galaxy once and for all. And they were not about to let it slip away, not after everything they had sacrificed, not after the cost they had already paid. The weapon hummed with energy. As they approached their final destination, the rebels felt its power surging through them, giving them the strength to push onward, even in the face of certain death. They had come too far to fail now. The galaxy's fate rested on their shoulders, and they would not falter. The rebels advanced on the Vothra command station, their ships cutting through space like a dagger aimed at the heart of their enemies. The final battle was imminent. Every movement, every decision, carried the weight of the galaxy's future. The weapon pulsed with raw power. As they closed in on their target, the rebels knew that the Vothra would do everything in their power to defend their command center. It was the last bastion of their empire, the final point of control, where their leadership remained hidden behind layers of defense. The rebels had no illusions about the danger they were walking into, but they had no choice. It was now or never. The Vothra were massing their forces and preparing for one last stand. Their ships swarmed around the command station, creating an impenetrable barrier designed to stop any assault. The rebels knew that breaking through would be nearly impossible, but they had the weapon, and they had the resolve to see it through to the end. As their fleet moved closer, the Vothra opened fire with everything they had, their weapons lighting up the dark expanse of space in a deadly dance of destruction. But the rebels were ready. They weaved through the onslaught, their ships agile and determined, dodging blasts and returning fire with precision. The battle raged on as the rebels fought their way forward toward the command center. Every second was a struggle, every inch gained was hard won. And yet they pressed on, their unity fueled by the memory of their fallen comrades, the sacrifice of Jax still fresh in their hearts. He had believed in them until the end, and now they would honor his legacy by finishing what they had started. They fought on, knowing that their victory would be his victory. The weapon at their disposal hummed louder as they approached the final phase of their assault. The rebels prepared to unleash its full potential. They had learned to control its power, but they knew the risks. The weapon could destroy them just as easily as it could destroy their enemies. But they had come too far to turn back now. They had come to the Vothra's doorstep, and they would not leave without securing their future. The moment arrived. The rebels were in position, and with a single command, the weapon was activated. Its energy surged out in a devastating wave of raw force, cutting through the Vothra's defenses like a hot knife through butter. The blast obliterated everything in its path, the Vothra ships disintegrating in a blinding explosion that rocked the very fabric of space itself. The rebels knew the Vothra would never recover from this strike. Their leadership wiped out, their fleets shattered. But as the weapon's energy faded, and the silence of space settled in, the rebels knew that their fight was not over yet. The command center was still standing, But the weapon had done its job. It had created the opening they needed to strike at the heart of the Vafra Empire. Now they had to finish it. The rebels launched their final assault, their ships surging forward toward the command center, weapons primed for the last push. The Vafra were not done yet. They retaliated with everything they had left. But their defenses were broken, and their will to fight had crumbled. The rebels pushed through the remnants of the enemy's forces with ruthless efficiency. The battle was almost over. The Vafra had no more reinforcements, no more strength to resist, and as the rebels entered the heart of the command station, they were met with nothing but the silence of victory. The final blow had been dealt. The Vafra Empire lay in ruins, and the galaxy was free. The rebels stood victorious in the control room of the Vafra's most prized possession. But the cost had been high. The weapon had done its job, but it had taken everything from them. The team looked at each other, exhausted and battered, but alive. They had won the war, they had secured their future, and they had honored the memory of all those who had fallen along the way. The galaxy was free, and though the scars of the battle would remain, the hope that had been sparked by Jax's sacrifice would live on for generations to come. The war was over, and the rebels had won.